An ominous sound. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming back after lunch. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our first session of the afternoon. And we have two fantastic speakers today. I will go ahead and introduce them in order. Our first speaker today is Alexander Roberts, an associate professor in classics from the University of Southern California. He's a Byzantinist, Greco-Arabist, and intellectual historian, specializing in Byzantine and medieval Middle Eastern scholars and their engagement with ancient intellectual traditions. His current work focuses on chemistry and its consequences in the Eastern Mediterranean and Islamic worlds. For those of you interested in knowing more about his work, he has a brand new article out in ISIS, Byzantine Engagement with Islamic Alchemy, that is very much worth checking out. And his title today is Translating the Concept of Alchemy from Modern English to Medieval Greek in Arabic and Back Again. Let's welcome Alex.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you to Lynn and anybody involved with this conference. It's so exciting for me to be here. It's a very different scholarly universe than I know, and I've been learning a ton. And I've been thinking a lot about the talks that already have come so far, and especially Professor Truitt's really thought-provoking lecture yesterday. I think we've already been grappling with a number of the themes that she set us up so elegantly to think about. And I think, although I didn't realize this, but the way I've been thinking about it, I think what I'm going to talk about today, hopefully in brief, is something, and it's an aspect of my current project on chemistry and its consequences or transformation of matter in Byzantium, the Islamic world, that I think speaks a little bit, or maybe is a sort of a small contribution to one of the themes that Professor Truitt raised, in that the interplay between the kind of famous theoretical thinkers like Bacon, and then the sort of concretizers or vernaculizers who are sort of trying to convey scientific practice in a more, maybe in that the particular text she was looking at in a more concrete way, like Chaucer. So the topic, as has already been mentioned in the title, is this sort of the way we have all these early Arabic texts that are gathered under the modern umbrella term alchemy, and we know that so many of them are translations from Greek. So again, the theme that we've been seeing, translations from Greek. But as Shirin Hamza was saying, I mean, these are not weird, outlandish texts translated from Greek. They're in Arabic. They seem totally at home. The Arabic technical vocabulary of such texts largely parallels the corresponding Greek vocabulary through loanwords and calques, a kind of construction of vocabulary that Eric was talking about. And did this terminology, I want to ask, this sort of correspondence, did that translate into a similar concept of the science or art that these texts addressed? In other words, was there a stable concept of alchemy in the transition from the Greek to the Arabic language, and more generally from one cultural context, if I may use this problematic term, to the other? Answering this question is a precondition, I would say, for answering the more general version, which is, was there ever such a thing as alchemy or an alchemical tradition before Europeans began to oppose the word to chemistry in the 17th century? Today, I propose to begin with the modern English term, alchemy itself. This is a deeply unsatisfying term for the historian's purpose, as specialists have long been aware. And yet, we still use it all the time, especially when talking about the Middle Ages. I will press this point by arguing that this modern term corresponds badly to Greek and Arabic vocabulary. The alternate terminology that I propose builds on and extends the work of Hellenists, Arabists, Western medievalists, and early modernists. Using several examples from Greek and Arabic texts and manuscripts, I will argue that alternatives to alchemy would help us better to make sense of medieval practices and thought. I'll conclude by briefly considering how this approach, if I have time, might help us to write a truly integrated diachronic history of the various practices, theories, and textual traditions currently grouped by modern scholarship, for better or worse, under the name of alchemy. So in a classic 1998 article, William Newman and Lawrence Principe showed that the term alchemy is contrasted with chemistry originated in the 17th century when a number of European professional chemists began to campaign against what had historically been a major subfield of their discipline, chrysopoeia, or gold making, leading them to invent a new terminological distinction referring to chemistry that did not reject chrysopoeia as alchemy with the al. Variants of alchemia, or alchemia, a loanword from the Arabic alchimia, had been common in Latin at least since the 13th century, but unlike modern alchemy, it was not opposed to a separate term like chemistry. The decision to distinguish between variants with the prefix al, like alchemia, and those without it, like chemia, was a polemical choice aided by Europeans' misunderstandings about the original meaning of the Arabic definite article alif lam. Their polemical aim was to amputate part of an early modern European discipline. Accordingly, we should be very careful in how we apply a word like alchemy, especially to any time or place where this polemical aim had not yet been realized, making sure that we agree on precisely what it means. Yet, while medievalists, Byzantinists, Syriacists, and Arabists are aware of the problem, we use the term alchemy routinely anyway, above all as an umbrella term to refer to texts and ideas that our fields have generally organized under this heading. But more problematically, we also sometimes still use it as a term of analysis, even though there's a surprising lack of consensus about what exactly the word means, to say nothing of the subtle penumbra of connotations that accompany the term and resist being dispelled by even the most scrupulously progressive definition. So, alchemy. Starting from its commonplace usage in modern English and other European languages, we might say that alchemy is the quest to transform base metals into gold. But that is far more restrictive than pre-modernists' actual usage of the term. Sometimes when we write it, it means the art of ennobling metals more generally, that is, transforming base metals into precious metals. Or more generally still, transforming inexpensive substances into expensive ones, since recipes for artificial pearls and gemstones are also grouped under the term alchemy. Sometimes it also includes passing off cheap imitations of precious substances as the real thing, fraud. At other times, it refers to various theories of chemistry meant to explain how such transformations are possible, often called alchemical theories. Other times, it means a particular textual tradition. Sometimes it even means whole cosmological systems that embrace theories of material transformation, astrological correspondences between planets and metals, cosmic sympathy, or even some kind of theological system or salvation history. Is alchemy all of these intellectual and artisanal practices at once? Or could it be that this apparent cluster of human activities is an artifact of our modern terminology rather than a natural way or a native way of grouping them? Seeing it as such would not mean denying any connection between these various human activities. Rather, it would mean acknowledging that we should not presuppose such connections, nor assume that connections, if they existed, were stronger within that cluster than connections to human activities beyond it. Instead, we would have to establish whether and how these various activities interrelate in each context, in each manuscript, in each social milieu that we seek from the fragmentary evidence to reconstruct. Building on a number of important theoretical discussions by historians of alchemy, as well as my own research, I propose my own experience, as one might say, I propose suspending use of the term alchemy for all contexts that require any sort of conceptual precision, using it only to refer broadly to the dossier of material that scholars have traditionally referred to as alchemical texts. It's a modern grouped dossier grouped by us, not necessarily by anybody else. Instead, I will propose a new conceptual vocabulary that will sound fairly familiar to specialists, but it's a little bit different. First of all, I propose implementing more systematically the precise terminology already in use by early modernists. For example, when we mean the attempt to synthesize gold or chrysopoeia, so that alchemy is a dossier, then we should say so rather than using alchemy as a synonym, as a sort of shorthand that allows us then to elide the difference between that and other things that fall under that umbrella term. More significantly, I've coined a new term to refer specifically to the textual tradition that describes its own purview as a sacred or divine art. I call this tradition the hierotechnical tradition, from the Greek phrase hieratechni, and its authors hierotechnical authors. My hope is that this sort of outlandish term calls attention to the sort of what we're talking about rather than allowing us to fudge it. This will be taken to refer only to texts that associate themselves with the sacred art explicitly or with references to recognizable set of authorities, or else texts that were retroactively associated with that tradition by later authors or scribes. And obviously each of these have a sort of different status within the, or a different historical story within the tradition, how they got to be part of it. Though this may seem similar to saying the alchemical tradition or alchemical texts, in practice, we included those categories many texts for which our only justification for grouping them with hierotechnical texts is that they are about chrysopoeia or metallurgy more general, or else that they appear in the same manuscript. The process by which this textual tradition was formed and texts and authors were added to it and placed under the name of the sacred art will remain an open question. The final term to introduce is more familiar, chemistry. By this, I propose to refer not to an institutionalized discipline like modern academic or industrial chemistry, but rather to the corresponding topic of inquiry, broadly understood, namely theories and practices of the transformation of matter. This usage can be found in the prose of some historians of alchemy, especially more recently, but it's rarely, if ever, used systematically in this way. We can speak of a historical subject's understanding of chemistry regardless of the tradition or discipline to which he or she belonged. So how shall we translate alchemy into medieval languages? A popular candidate has been the words that look and sound the most like our modern term itself. The Latin term alchemia derives from Arabic alchimia, which derives in turn from the Greek word chimia, perhaps via Syriac. But beyond etymology, it's not clear what these words have to do with alchemy, nor that they all meant, that is alchemy, our term, that is, nor that they all meant the same thing, nor even that any one of them had a stable meaning across the whole history of the Greek, Arabic, and medieval Latin languages. We will have to look at individual contexts, as others have already been proposing and arguing and emphasizing and showing. Manuscript witness to what modern scholars call the Greek alchemical corpus is a 10th or 11th century codex now in Venice, Marcianus Grecus 299. In this manuscript, especially in its front matter, we find a clear and consistent vocabulary for referring to the textual tradition, excerpts of which it compiles, the authors of its texts, and the domain of knowledge which they address. That terminology has nothing to do with the words etymologically related to alchemy. Instead, the manuscript repeatedly refers to the subject matter of individual texts it contains as the sacred art, the divine art, or the sacred and divine art. Sometimes the subject is described as chrysopoeia, making gold. In the very small number of instances where the manuscript uses forms of the word chimia, they tend to refer to artisanal activities rather than, say, transmutation theory, thus meaning something like practical or applied chemistry and not necessarily having to do with transmutation at all. Could be, doesn't have to be. The manuscript's table of contents regularly refers to its authors as philosophers and sages, philosophy, Sophie. Its dodecasyllable heading reads, right up here, Vivru sophon pefika sin theo pinax. I am the Pinax, the table of contents, by God's grace of this book of the sages. Similarly, the list of authors is described as names of the philosophers, names of the philosophers of the divine science and art. And the table of signs is entitled The Signs of the Science of the Things Included Within the Technical Writings of the Philosophers, that is, hierotechnical texts in my vocabulary, and especially of the secret philosophy, as it is called among them. In this last heading, we encounter an adjectival form, technikos, that may correspond roughly to the term I've coined. As for terms like philosophy and philosophers, it's typical for modern scholars to gloss such self-designations as actually meaning alchemists. But of course, the claim that these texts are making is not that alchemists, a real thing in the world, are philosophers too, or the real philosophers, but rather that philosophers legitimately concern themselves with the sacred art, chrysopoeia, and generally chemical theory. a point underscored by the appearance of the names of many well-known Greek philosophers as authors of the texts in the manuscript, from Democritus to Stephen of Alexandria. This claim that real philosophers could and did take an interest in the sacred art should not be dismissed out of hand, but rather evaluated with care. Pyrotechnical authors are thus presented as belonging to the wider social category of philosophers whose discipline was philosophy, philosophia. And of course, this could be the agenda of the compiler of this manuscript, but it's also a language that one sees reflected often in the texts themselves that are gathered here. The word chimia hardly ever appears in the manuscript, a total of 3 times on the 196 large format folios of the Codex Marcianus. That the word is so rare in the manuscript that forms the core source of the modern construct that we call the Greek alchemical corpus is worth underscoring, because modern scholars sometimes suggest or say outright, as I've already mentioned, that chimia was the Greek word for alchemy. If this is so, and if Codex Marcianus is assumed to be a compilation about alchemy by and for alchemists, then we would expect chimia and derived forms to appear frequently. At least I would. 2 of the 3 instances of chimia occur in a single passage. That passage is part of the longest and most prominently placed text in the Codex, Stephen of Alexandria's Lectures. In it, as scholars have often observed, Stephen distinguishes, often for this tiny field, of course, Stephen distinguishes between mythiki chimia and mystiki chimia. Now, without going into details now, I think it makes most sense to read this as a distinction between descriptive accounts of specific material transformations on the one hand, and an exegetical account revealing the hidden structure, that's the mystiki, the hidden structure of matter that explains all those transformations. If this reading of Stephen is correct, then mystiki chimia would mean something quite close to theoretical chemistry. So does that undermine what I'm saying? No, I would claim, on the other hand, the passage and the phrase secret and hidden chimia, mystikike crypti, itself makes clear that this meaning stands in contrast to the usual meaning of unqualified chimia. The uniqueness of Stephen's intentionally unusual usage of chimia in the manuscript also reinforces that this was not generally how pyrotechnical authors or pyrotechnicians referred to their own activities, at least again, not in the sample provided by our compiler. Now, the only other passage in the manuscript to use the word chimia is in the pyrotechnical commentary by Olympiodorus, which makes passing reference to the hidden art of chimia. Chimia appears here as an art that produces phenomena which must then be interpreted, a task that goes beyond the art itself. We find something similar if we turn to the word chimeftis, which we would expect to mean a specialist in chimia based on morphology. As far as I've been able to discern, chimeftis appears exactly once in the entire Codex Marcianus, in a passage formatted as the end of a text by the author known as the anonymous philosopher. The text there, have I gone there? I think there we go. The text there uses it to refer to the author of a recipe, that is, of a practical description of a technical procedure, cited in response to a potential challenge to offer testimony from the ancient texts, εκ των αρχαίων γραφών. So perhaps in Middle Byzantine usage, the learned commentators on such a recipe were philosophy, Middle Byzantine or also late antique here, while the practitioners, including those who recorded their recipes, were chimefte. There's a tentative proposal. Among medieval Greek-speaking specialists in the sacred art, then, there was a clear distinction between practical or artisanal chemistry, chimepsis, and its theoretical interpretation, philosophia. And of course, philosophia is a discipline that interprets all sorts of different things, natural phenomena, not only chimepsis. Meanwhile, philosophy envisioned in the late antique and Byzantine tradition as a grand enterprise, embracing all systematic production of knowledge, worth its salt, or universal knowledge in any case, included the interpretation of chemical phenomena, just as it also included all true sciences, from the sciences of celestial and terrestrial motion to ontology, epistemology, and logic. As for our modern term alchemy, translating its vague and muddled semantic range into medieval Greek proves a nearly impossible task. Equivalent to neither chimia nor chimepsis nor philosophia, our alchemy looks more and more like a product of the modern era, whose application to the past may be more of a hindrance than a help. The situation in Arabic is similar. As is well known, the Arabic terminology for chemistry, and as I've already mentioned, chemistry, transmutation, the sacred art, largely derives from the Greek as loanwords and calques. Greek chimia became kimia in Arabic. The yera techni became as-sana' al-ilahiyya, or simply as-sana'a, or as-sina'a, the art, while sana'at al-dhahab was used to render chrysopia. So you already, here we have a place where by putting it in Arabic, you end up using the same word, sana'a, where in Greek we had different words, chrysopia versus techni. As with the Greek chimia, it is typical for modern scholars to translate chimia as alchemy. This is no mere convention. It's clear from how we talk about chimia, understood as alchemy, that we expect chimia to refer above all to an occult science concerned with transmutation and chrysopia, as modern alchemy often does, and are surprised when it does not. But the exceptions are, in fact, quite frequent. The 9th century Muslim philosopher Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi wrote books called The Kimia of Perfume and Distillations, Kimia al-Atq wa al-Tasaidat, and The Kimia of Cookery, Kimia al-Tabikh. These books are about the artificial production of perfumes and spices. In both instances, kimia clearly seems to mean something like, again, practical chemistry. These usages, distant as they are from chrysopia and the philosopher's stone, should not be dismissed as metaphorical, but rather as clues about how this word was used and understood. If kimia meant practical chemistry, as this evidence suggests, then perhaps chrysopia and the like were understood as a special case of this broader phenomenon, a special case of this broader practice of manipulating matter in order to produce substances that resembled or were sometimes even understood to be identical to naturally occurring substances. Sorry, those were the titles I meant to show you. This understanding of the term finds confirmation in non-hierotechnical sources. In a fatwa issued against kimia, the 13th or 14th century Hanbali jurist Taqi-d-Din ibn Taymiyyah, understood kimia in quite the same way, as a purported method to produce precious metals, but also various other substances like rose water, ma' al-warq, and ambergris, anbar. At another point, Ibn Taymiyyah feels the need to explain that books that describe themselves as being about the art, as-sana'a, are often in fact books on kimia. The context is Ibn Taymiyyah's description of the funeral of a practitioner of kimia. He recounts that the man had bought many scholarly books, kutub al-ilm, and therefore, he says, I was present at the sale of his books. Then the auctioneer, al-Munadi, stood up and called out books of the art, kutub al-sana'a, which often means books of kimia. For they say it is the science of the precious stone, ilm al-hajar al-mukarram, which is the science of wisdom, ilm al-hikmah, and they know it by all sorts of expression. Ibn Taymiyyah goes on to narrate that he rose his voice to alert the authorities that these books contain instructions for counterfeiting and that they should therefore be burned. Here I would argue we can see Ibn Taymiyyah, a hostile outsider, polemically seeking to conflate three different things. Kimia, understood as practical chemistry, the hierotechnical tradition, kutub al-sana'a, which did indeed concern itself with the philosopher's stone, and counterfeiting. Counterfeiting was, of course, an illegal activity requiring the know-how referred to as kimia, and the hierotechnical tradition discussed techniques for chrysopia involving kimia. But these were not all the same thing. Perhaps we will find that polemicists like Ibn Taymiyyah helped pave the way towards the modern conflation of these same things under the name of alchemy. So enough about kimia. What about Arabic descriptions of the hierotechnical tradition itself? First, I'll just briefly say that practitioners and theorists of the art are referred to in much the same way as in the Greek alchemical corpus. Ibn Adim, a well-known source for this question, talks about al-hukama wal-falasifa, and basically it's just, again, imported, but also internalized, and maybe imported is even the wrong word, again, as Shivin has reminded us. It's part of the same intellectual context in a sense. So these same hierotechnical self-designations can be found in the writings of an active participant in and defender of the hierotechnical tradition, the 13th and 14th century scholar Izz-ad-Din Aydamir ibn Ali al-Jaddaki, who died in 1342. In his book, Nihayat al-Talab fi Sharh al-Muktasab, a commentary on an earlier hierotechnical book, al-Jaddaki refers to his subject as divine wisdom and the philosophical art, al-hikmah al-ilahiyya wa al-sina'a al-falsafiyya, which he describes as being handed down by the most learned people of wisdom, al-hikmah al-fadil. At the same time, in a different book, his commentary on the hierotechnical chrysopoetic poetry of Ibn Al-Faras, Al-Jillaki calls Ibn Sina a philosopher, indeed one of the cleverest recent philosophers, min ahthaq falasfat al-mutaakhirin, even though Ibn Sina doubted the hierotechnical claim to truly change one metal into another. This shows that Al-Jillaki understood the word philosopher much as historians do. Where he differed from some modern historians is rather in considering hierotechnical authors to be philosophers just like Ibn Sina, and to get some things right where he got them wrong. The process of translating alchemy back into Greek and Arabic is instructive. Do I have time? I can maybe end here if I've, so I'll just quickly conclude. To make sense of what medieval scholars wrote about the transformation of matter and to translate their ideas back into English, I've proposed an alternate terminology. Notably, this new terminology fits not only the Greek or the Arabic material, but both. Perhaps unsurprisingly, translating between medieval Greek and medieval Arabic is much easier than attempting to square our own baggage-laden term alchemy with their shared thought world. And I'll end there because I think I've taken too much time. So thank you so much for your patience and attention.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Ahmed Ragab from the Johns Hopkins University. He's an associate professor, a historian, a physician, and a documentary filmmaker, a triad I don't often hear, which is pretty amazing. His research focuses on the history of medicine in the pre-modern Middle East and the Islamic world, as well as colonial and post-colonial medicine, science and technology, and other subjects. He also studies and publishes on gender and sexuality in the medieval and early modern Middle East. You may probably know him from his many esteemed publications on hospitals in the Islamic world, including his 2015 book, The Medieval Islamic Hospital, Medicine, Religion, and Charity, and a series of articles from there that I think are quite important in the history of medicine in the Islamic world. His topic today is why books, writing, orality, and objecthood in the Islamic translation movement.
Afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you to Ellie and to Len for organizing and putting this together, and also for all the people involved in this organization. It's such a fantastic time. It's always a challenge to be in the panel after lunch. So I've been there. So, but we'll see what happened. And it doesn't help that I don't have any sort of slides. So you're going to have to look at me and sleep while you're looking at me. So I want to start my talk today by a story that is reported by Al-Qifti, who is a historian and a scholar who grew up in Egypt, lived in Aleppo around the 11th century, 12th century rather, and wrote a biography of physicians, scholars, and philosophers. In one of his accounts, he talks about a physician by the name of Ibn Abi al-Baqa. Ibn Abi al-Baqa was from Baghdad, and he became a very important physician for the caliphal court, served the Abbasid Caliph al-Nasir, and Al-Qifti tells us that actually Ibn Abi al-Baqa was even trusted to serve the caliph's wives and concubines and the women in the caliph's household, which signify how much he was a trustworthy physician. Even moreover, when the caliph wanted to send a gift to the Atabeg of Aleppo, the Zangid court, he decided to send his own physician, Ibn Abi al-Baqa, to go and check on the Atabeg. Probably this is the time that Al-Qifti met Ibn Abi al-Baqa himself in Aleppo. And he says that the physician came with camels and camels. He says probably 20 camels loaded with books. He always had so many books. And, the 20 camels, that's just his travel thing. That's what he will read on the road, because he was going back to Baghdad. This is just, the travel thing. He then adds that Ibn Abi al-Baqa was known to go to the book markets and look for books that he doesn't have or books that he really likes. And when he finds a book that he really, really likes, and he's scared that it might be overpriced or that the bookseller might make it too expensive for him, he would cut a couple of pages from the book so that to make the book faulty and to drop its price, and so that he's able to buy it. Now, I realize talking about destroying books in the Schönberg is not, my best moment, but I promise no books were harmed in this talk. And there is a point out there, I promise you. The idea of scholars, physicians, or philosophers collecting books and creating big libraries and going into book markets, trying to get as many books as possible, is something that is not unique to Ibn Abi al-Baqa or unique to this particular story. Somebody like Ibn Nadim, for example, which we just heard about him again, as a bookmaker who wrote this huge catalog of books in Baghdad, and I will talk about him more today, writes about another person who was also who's actually living in the Hamadani Levant. He heard about him, Ibn Nadim heard about this person from a friend, and he traveled from Baghdad to meet him. There, he found that this person had a huge collection of books stored in a number of rooms inside his house, but also underneath the house. And he did not want to meet Ibn Nadim because he was very worried that the ruler of Aleppo at the time would actually know about his library and decide to take it, force him to sell it or to confiscate it. After many, many weeks of trying to convince him that he is trustworthy, Ibn Nadim is able to access the actual collection. There, he finds treasures that he has never seen before, a lot of really old books, books that are rotting, books that are falling apart, but also books in languages that Ibn Nadim did not or could not recognize. The man trusted Ibn Nadim and told him that when he is about to die, he will send for him so that he could come and take at least part of the collection. But Ibn Nadim says that the man died and never sent back. So that's a sad story. What I intend to do in this talk today is to think about the question of books and the objecthood of books. What do books actually mean? And what role do books as objects, cultural objects, play in our discussion of transmission of knowledge, and in particular in relation to the translation? Here, I'm not focusing on the physical construction of books itself, the types of paper, the ink, etc., or the other questions that are asked primarily, for example, by the discipline of history of the book, but I'm asking about the cultural, if you will, life or story of the book. In the larger project, I want to also ask about the place of books within medical practice. What do physicians do with books? I'm here trying to follow up on what Rainey Daston described as the sciences of the archives, when she described how particular sciences have a very specific relations to libraries and archives, where these libraries and archives serve basically as their laboratories. I want to ask a similar question about the relationship between medicine as a practice and books. What do physicians do with books? I will go to Ibn Nadim to start there. Ibn Nadim, as I mentioned, we know very little about him. We know that he was a bookmaker and a bookseller who lived in Baghdad. He died in 990. Some argue that he died when he was 60 or 70 years old. So he lived his entire life in the heart or the middle of the 10th century Baghdad, a place that was full of books that are coming from all over the world, and basically the heart of what we call today the translation movement, or rather the second half of what we would call today the translation movement, in air quotes. Ibn Nadim, we don't know much about his life. He writes this book that is called Al-Fihrist, or one could translate it as a catalog, which he describes as a collection of the names and biographies of the authors, the names of the books and the names of the authors and the biographies of the authors of almost all the books that he encountered in his work as a book collector and a bookseller in Baghdad. The word Al-Fihrist itself is a Persian word, and a lot of scholars today argue that Ibn Nadim was responsible for bringing this word into much wider usage in Arabic. The word in contemporary Arabic continues to be used to mean a catalog or a table of contents. So you'll see it in any Arabic book that you open, the word is there, meaning basically table of contents. Ibn Nadim's project is deeply concerned with books, both as metaphorical and physical objects. The very first chapter is about languages. He describes the different languages that he knows. He gives examples of their scripts, and he talks about the different calligraphic forms that these languages use to, or that are used to write these languages, and how they fit particular purposes. For example, particular mode of calligraphy for a holy book, another for a message from a king to another king, a third for a message from a king to one of the regional governors, for example. After the description of scripts and calligraphy, he goes on into describing writing tools, describe pens, how they are prepared, how they are different from one language to another, how the pens that are done for languages that write from left to right are different from those from right to left or from up to down, and how often people need to sharpen their pens, for example. Talks about ink. He talks about the different types of paper and writing surfaces, and which is good for what purpose exactly. After describing all of these material components of the book, if you will, we start to actually read about actual books. The first chapter about the actual books is about the holy books. It starts with all the religious texts and scriptures of the different nations around the world, or the different civilizations, and he describes, where, when they were first written, where you can find them, what type of writing they are written in, what are their original languages, etc. And then he moves into describe in a chapter, quite a long chapter, as one can imagine, about the Quran. When it comes to the Quran here, we start to see this dynamic or dialectical, if you will, relationship between books as physical objects and as metaphorical objects. On one hand, we have the book as a physicality that is made of paper and ink and materials, and on the other hand, as a metaphor referring to a collection of knowledge. The chapter on the Quran is decidedly about the metaphorical book, not the physical. While later on, we will read about how many pages are in a given epistle, for example, how many lines are typically on a given page, how to understand if this was a forgery or not, or a good book or not, to buy it or not to buy it. In the chapter on the Quran, we're not faced with this at all. We're talking about the process of collecting the Quran and making sure that the actual text survives. As a matter of fact, in this chapter, the physical book emerges as an accidental object, an object that came into existence only out of necessity, because those who remembered the Quran were dying in war. And it is only at this point that the Caliph decided we have to collect the Quran and write it down. While Ibn Nadim is very hostile to any process of burning or destroying books, and completely unkind to anybody who endangers books, he has no qualms at all in describing how the third Caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, was worried about the multiplicity of copies of the Quran. So he decided to create 7 canonical copies, send them all over the empire, and order the collection and the burning of any other scrap of paper even that claims to have the Quran. In other words, he did not have a problem with the destruction of the physical books there, precisely because what is important in this chapter was never the physical book, but rather the metaphorical book, the knowledge inside the book. Now, if we just move forward in the book and look at the chapter that is dedicated to philosophy and to the sciences, Ibn Nadim starts with a description of collecting books. He gives accounts, for example, of mythical and semi-mythical sovereigns, particularly Persian kings, how they built big storehouses, how they commissioned the writing of different books that would have all the different knowledge in the world. He describes how each one of them would look throughout their large realm to find the driest and the most suitable place to store books so that they don't rot, and to find the best type of paper in order to write these things and store them. He describes how, for example, structures as big as the pyramids of Egypt were built in Babylon and in Isfahan in order to store books on them, although a lot of these structures do not survive. Collecting books, building structures to preserve books become a function of royalty, a function of good governance. It is only the powerful and the good kings who have the wherewithal to understand that they need to collect the books and they need to preserve them. And at the same time, they are the only ones who actually are able, have the money and the power that enables them to take on such an endeavor. He describes, for example, how Alexander, an important exception here, Alexander comes into, as he invades Persia and comes to Babylon, he finds all of these books, he sifts through them, he decides what's important, translates it into Greek and sends it to Greece, and the rest he decides to burn. The books disappear from Babylon for some time until Shapur II is able to convince Constantine the Great to give him some of these books that returned to Babylon and now translated again into Persia. Now, I understand not all these dates match, but it's a big story. It's not, we're not here for the accurate dating of these kings. It's for the process, right? It is therefore not a surprise that the next step would be talking about how the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad are undertaking a process very similar to these mythical and amazing kings and collecting books. So the subchapter that talks about the translation and that is often cited in our scholarship is actually titled on the reason why there are so many of these books, books of the ancients, books of the sciences in these lands, that is Iraq. And it starts, as many of you already know, by describing Al-Ma'mun's dream. Aristotle visits Al-Ma'mun in a dream, convinces him that he has to collect knowledge, and Al-Ma'mun starts on a shopping spree, if you will, sending his agents everywhere around the world to find books, buy them, and bring them to Baghdad. Ibn Nadim goes on to describe this process in a lot of details. Describes names of people that we know as major translators. It describes courtiers, it describes governors. All of these people are looking for the storehouses that are hidden underground, the places that all temples that are closed, and also some of them are sent to the Byzantine emperor in order to convince him to sell or give books to the Abbasid court. In one instance, he looks at, there's a big storehouse that is found near Isfahan that has a lot of materials, and a lot of these materials are written in a language that no one can read. Ibn Nadim says, even though no one could read it, it was still shipped to Baghdad. The books were actually in very bad shape. They were made mostly of leather, they were rotting, they were falling apart. And Ibn Nadim said when the camels carrying them arrived into Baghdad, it was so smelly, the entire city was smelling. Interestingly, however, once they arrived into Baghdad, slowly the books were getting better. Rotting stopped and the smell disappeared. It is as if the books were starting to get healthier once they arrived in a place that truly appreciated them. The process of collection that Ibn Nadim describes is purposefully content-blind. None of these books were read before people decided to bring them. In fact, again, as I just mentioned, some of them were written in languages that no one could read. The process of collection was not a process of trying to borrow sciences from neighboring civilizations. It was an archaeological process, a process of collecting relics and remains of a dead civilization and bringing it back and trying to understand it. While this might be easy to understand when Ibn Nadim is talking about ancient Persian empires that have these old storehouses in Isfahan, it might be a little bit more difficult, but more instructive for us to see how he describes the process of bringing Greek books from the Byzantine Empire in exactly the same way. He starts by telling us how Constantine the Great and the Christians decided to ban the learning of all ancient knowledge, of all sciences and all philosophy, because they were worried that it might lead their people astray. And so when Al-Ma'mun sent his courtiers and messengers to the Byzantine emperor, the Byzantines have showed them big temples that are locked and walled off, big storage houses that are full of books that nobody had opened in centuries, and they didn't want to open. He kept prodding and paying money and paying bribes, and ultimately these storehouses were opened and the books were taken. The books that are brought from the Byzantine in a very similar way to the books that are brought from storehouses around Isfahan are also perceived by Ibn Nadim as essentially relics of a lost civilization. A lost civilization that lift these archaeological remains that need to be collected and cared for one more time. I want to take a very brief detour here and talk about another important aspect of books and understanding books in the Abbasid Empire or in 10th century Baghdad, and the debates around writing and orality, as it will give us a better idea about what Ibn Nadim is trying to do and the significance of his account. A number of us know that this is a period where scholars of hadith or prophetic traditions were debating questions of the importance of writing versus orality. Scholars have argued, medieval scholars were arguing that there are reports from the Prophet that says one should not write what the Prophet says, and that the Prophet had prohibited his companions from writing his own words for fear of its being mixed with the Quran. Now, Orientalist scholars, as late as the mid 20th century, exaggerated a little bit this debate around quote unquote prohibiting writing, and made it all and it appears in a lot of these early writings as essentially an old oral culture meeting the written cultures of Byzantium and the Sassanid Empire. This ended up flattening a lot of the nuance in the description and the debates around that these hadith scholars were having. Yes, there was a concern sometime before the Quran was fully established as a text. There was a concern about mixing the Quran, which is the word of God, with the prophetic traditions, the word of the Prophet. But this concern was not really operative in the 10th century. In the 10th century, two other concerns were important. Books are paradoxical objects. They are very helpful for learning, for memorizing. They allow us to remember things, and that's why all of these scholars are always using writing materials to help themselves remember. Aide-memoire, if you will. But at the same time, they are dangerously seductive in how they are accessible. They seductively bring people to learn from books without teachers, and that's a problem. Books are dangerous because they invite you to read them, and as you read them, you start to think that you know what you're talking about while you don't, and that's a problem. For hadith in particular, there is even an added layer, which is how hadith is constructed around chains of transmission. This is the main way of establishing certainty. I report a hadith from Shireen, for example. Shireen reports it from Eli, and on until you reach the Prophet. Now, if there is a book in the middle, we're unable to fully verify this chain of transmission. If instead I met Shireen and listened to the hadith from them, I read it in a book that they wrote, now this chain of transmission becomes very difficult to verify. So although this is a period where we get the largest and the most important collections of hadith that existed, that continue to be in use in the Muslim world today, it was also the period where the big prohibitions or the big stigma on learning from the books that, again, Shireen mentioned in relation to Ibn Radwan, for example, was established. Learning from books on their own is a problem. Proper learning need to come from teachers. Byzantine books came without teachers. That's the key thing here. By bringing these books precisely without teachers, by bringing them as independent object that can be saved or salvaged, if you will, and that can be opened and then understood or misunderstood, corrected, and removed, burned, sent away, we're looking here at, again, not a living civilization that the Muslims are trying to learn from, but rather relics of a dead civilization. Coming very close to the end of my time, so I'll just end with a couple of big methodological points for our discussion today. I talked before about the centrality of translation in the history, or translation movement rather, in the history of Islamic sciences, building on the work of Achille Mbembe, for example, and building on the idea of the Aj and Durée. I argued that the writing of the history of Islamic sciences happens in the durée of translation, meaning that it always comes back over and over again to debates around translation, movement, and transmission in a way that reinforces over and over again the importance of the movement and the translation from Greek into Arabic. What I'm wondering about here, what happens if we start to think about translation in a different way? In fact, I'm arguing that translation as a category continues to prove to be deeply inefficient, if not analytically problematic. In this particular case, the act of translation, of moving books from Greek into Arabic, is entirely secondary to what is actually happening, which is book collection. What happens if we start to think about the quote-unquote translation movement as an act of a civilization that understood itself to be the custodian on world knowledge and decided to collect relics from everywhere? The movement of languages here become far less important. It becomes rather another chapter in a long history of the Near East, a place that has been always multilingual and continue to be multilingual. What I'm trying to say here, if we start to think about the logic of the quote-unquote translation movement as a process of book collection, as opposed to a process of knowledge transmission, we're able to have a very different understanding of what is happening in this period. Let me take this even a step further. I argue that the centrality of knowledge, of movement of knowledge across different languages is related to how a lot of these languages stand to code particular racial identities. In other words, if Greek does not stand for white, and if Arabic does not stand for Moor, and Farsi for Persian, and on and on and on, then we would be a lot more receptive to trying to understand the movement across these languages, not as movement from different blocks of people, but rather as, again, the movement of knowledge in the same region that has always been multilingual, that has always been had speakers of all these languages at the same time. I would argue here that we need to move beyond the category of translation and to think about the objecthood of books as a way for us to understand knowledge collection in a different way. And I believe that if we do that, we will be able to think about language categories differently. We would be able to remove basically or make Greek an insufficient stand-in for white. And if we're able to make Greek an insufficient stand-in for white, we might be able to teach about Galen as an Anatolian physician as opposed to a Greek physician. Thank you all so much.
So much. Well, a number of questions. Go for the floor first.
Thank you both so much for those really rich presentations. My question is for Ahmed. Ahmed, I'd like to invite you to say a little bit more about what this shift in understanding the Greco-Arabic translation movement instead as a book collection movement. Can you say a little more about how this is different from the bad old days of seeing that translation movement essentially, and seeing all of the Arabic or the Arabophone world as essentially one of like conservators of knowledge? Thank you.
So much, Ellie. That's a great question. I didn't have time to say that, so thank you for asking this question. So a number of things that I believe there will be a series of differences. First, it will actually reveal how what we would call today, or ancient Greek knowledge, for example, is only a part of a larger landscape, right? We keep talking about the need to talk about Persian materials and Indian materials and Chinese materials, etc. But again, the centrality of this kind of Greco-Arabic that leads to Arabic Latin continues to dominate the field and makes it extremely difficult for us to do this, think about it more largely. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the durée of translation poses for us a series of questions that we have to talk about, which is what is foreign and what is indigenous, right? What is the place of the sciences of the ancients as opposed to Islamic knowledge? What became religiously prohibited and what became religiously permitted? So these are questions that, because we're talking about foreign knowledge coming into a different space, being translated into a different space, we're forced to deal with these questions. Let's think about it, when we think about it as essentially, this is a book collection endeavor. These people did not think of these materials as materials that have to be understood in a specific way, precisely because they came without a teacher, right? So they're just books. They may as well be, completely useless. And they felt, therefore, complete liberty to deal with them in any way that they want. If we're thinking about it in this way, the whole idea of did it match or did it conflict with indigenous culture, Islamic knowledge, Islamic religion, becomes really a moot point, because ultimately they were under no obligation to think of these materials as having to be in that way or having to be faithful to this particular style or not. At the more practical level, I think it will allow us to move a lot of, our time and effort and, ink, if you will, from the discussion of the, the survivance or the lack thereof of particular concept or particular words, not concepts even, to thinking about the life of this knowledge and practice. So, these are some of the things that I can immediately imagine as happening once we move beyond the idea that translation is all about this type of language moving, or as Shireen put it really, really nicely, this kind of transcultural process. We don't think about it in that way, then it becomes a different story. I'll add one more thing, which is sort of almost on the flip side. We're very, if we just move up in time into the early modern period and think about the collection practices that Europeans did with indigenous communities. A lot of these big extractive practices appear to almost have come with no precedence. I believe the quote-unquote translation movement is part of the precedence, right? So we can actually see a longer history of extractive processes that existed as part of these knowledge systems that, and therefore it will allow us to understand how Muslims, for example, dealt with knowledge in Timbuktu or in West Africa, and or in North Africa or in India in a very different way. Once we start to put them not in the traditionally brown position of trying to, take something and make something good of it, a recycler, into this kind of dominant collector, salvager position, it just opens a whole host of other questions that might have very ugly answers about these people, but who cares?
You so much, both of you, for those papers. My question is for Ahmed as well. As you were speaking, I had that image from the Maqamat of this library and these books stacked up. You were able to conjure that image for me without slides, so that is a congratulations. But in your title and in your method, I was wondering what happens to bodies. Where are the bodies in all of this? Are these empty? Because as somebody who works with the art of the book, I'm very well aware that these are just traces of a world. They're traces of vast intellectual life. And in the Fehrist, I'm interested in where is the body? Are these empty bodies receiving knowledge? Sometimes when we think of translation, we think of the movement of knowledge, we think of, people who are actually containers of that knowledge that can go from Esfahan to Baghdad and carry that knowledge with them. They may not have the book, but they have the knowledge, or they have the teacher with them. So where's the body in your framework?
That's a fantastic question. So let me put it this way. I mentioned very briefly that I'm thinking of books as paradoxical epistemic objects, right? They're very important for remembering, but if you use them, it means you can't remember. They should be collected and saved, but in order for them to be collected or found, they had to be forgotten. In the same way, this is the dialectic relationship between the body or the hearts of men, as the saying in Arabic goes, and the book.
the proper way of knowledge is, as you said, kept in people's hearts, right? So the right way to learn is to memorize, to learn with a teacher, the book becoming a secondary thing that you would consult only when your memory fails you. And the best teachers, their memories never fail them. And when it does, they will probably stop teaching, right? The book becomes extremely important as an object precisely because it stands in for the absent body. So what I'm saying is, when books become extremely important without their teachers, they become, in the imaginary of these scholars, a sign of a decadence. That's why they are without teachers, right? And they also become, when the books are able to speak for themselves, they also speak for the inefficiency, unimportance of the teachers. Let me give you a flip example of how, for example, the Byzantine books were actually in other parts of the Islamic world came with teachers. So Ibn Juljul, who is a physician and a scholar in Andalusia, writing again in the 10th century, writes about the reception of the Dioscorides Materia Medica. Now, Dioscorides arrives into Andalusia, translated by Basil in Arabic, was translated in Baghdad and moved to Cordoba. And Ibn Juljul says the book was a disaster. It has all of these Persian words that no one understood. It had the names of plants, whether in Persian or transliterated Greek, and nobody knew what this was. So it just stayed there. Nobody touched it. Nobody knew what to do with it. Until the Umayyad Caliph of Andalus sent to the Byzantine emperor asking for a copy, a Greek copy of the Dioscorides, and this time asked for a monk who speaks both Greek and Latin. And it is this monk that came, sat together with people who are speaking Latin, Romance, and Arabic, and this workshop is the one that produced a new translation of the Dioscorides that now included the names of plants in Latin or Romance or Arabic, basically West African Arabic, right? So in that case, you see here, the Arabic book is the one that came without a teacher and became useless, just a relic. And it is the Byzantine book that came with a teacher and therefore became useful. So what I'm trying to say here, your point about the relationship between the book and the body is extremely important. And I'm precisely arguing that the absence of the body is a sign of the decadence and insufficiency of how you can learn from the book.
I mean, books also are very smart technologies. There are things in books that make them, extra didactic. There are translations, there are kinds of scripts there. So there are ways in which the book is a technology in certain contexts that don't necessitate that the makers are aware there might not be a teacher. I mean, this might not work for the Abbasid context, but for later contexts in the Islamic world, you have translation, you have glosses, you have all sorts of things that make the book stand in for that teacher who might not be there.
So yes, I agree on this description of the book in general, although we still, none of the institutions in the West give PhDs on people just reading and coming to take an exam with no teacher still. So we still require a teacher. But I disagree with the idea that later on in the Islamic world, the teacher became less important. And I think you can see ijazat, for example, or people enumerating their teachers and the books and who they learned the books with as late as the 19th century. In fact, in some circles today, among those who are learning in sort of traditional settings, you still need a teacher. And without a teacher, it's still, you can learn it, of course, but it will always be, you'll always be seen as less than by everybody.
I was just gonna, Dot had her hand up from the audience, but after that, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Why doesn't she go ahead? I think she had her hand up
Yeah.
before.
Okay. Hi there. Thank you both for your talks. I feel like they're both thinking about usefulness in different but interesting ways. I have a question about alchemy and chemistry, and thinking about terminology. As someone who I'm working on 16th and 17th century alchemy in England, and how this is a word that is contested and its boundaries are changing depending on the practitioner. I thought it was interesting with Newman and Principe, they talk about alchemy and chemistry, and they kind of point that this pair of terms in this modern context have become oppositional. And so they actually propose, a third term, which is chemistry with a Y. And I was curious about, in your kind of developing your own terminology, why alchemy doesn't work, but chemistry does, if they're kind of a matched pair.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I've been thinking about I suppose the simple way I would clarify it is that I am intentionally using chemistry as an etic term that is not attempting to reflect the actor's categories. So it's intentionally a term that is to encapsulate a topic of inquiry. And I don't see a place for alchemy to do that unless it means transmutation in a very narrow sense, as we often sometimes use it. But the risk is that if we define it as that, we'll still bring in all the other baggage. And I think we risk that a little bit with chemistry, but actually the modern use of I find the use of chemistry in modern English matches closer to what I want it to mean. So that's my thinking there. And about their tripartite terminology, which I think I get the sense there's I don't know the field, the sort of early modern field as well, but I get the sense they're sort of different. Some people have sort of taken it up, other people have resisted it, or the reason I don't like it, I find there's a lot. I think their article is brilliant and it does so much to have, but their tripartite terminology, I think, risks sort of in a way incidentally isolating the early modern period by suggesting that we have a sort of disciplinary progression from alchemy to chemistry. Thus, chemistry is this sort of hybrid between alchemy and chemistry, which are understood to be real things that then are now there's a hybrid that takes place then, but we can still see, and of course, part of the subtext is, and as a lot of people have been talking about, like a lot of these things stand in for things. And chemistry stands in for like real science, which I think is a risk in my using it, but it's also a provocation that I can say like Byzantine chemistry, Islamic chemistry, and then we can ask, does that mean something? And it sort of at least is a sort of a dialectic. And I think the risk of alchemy to chemistry is that it sort of bakes in a narrative of progress towards modern real science that I think risks then missing the different ways people are rigorously thinking about material transformation. So I don't know if that gets to all of your question, but that's sort of my thinking. I would love to. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yep, there's actually a couple of questions from Zoom for each of the speakers. So first we have one for Ahmed. Can you tell us, first of all, they said fascinating talk. Can you tell us who were the readers and the target audience of Ibn al-Nadim al-Firist in his time? And were there any commentaries for this important book in medieval Islamic world?
That's a great question. Most likely the readership was, writers, scholars, students, book buyers, essentially. So it comes from, at the intersection of a number of genres, although we do not have other examples of books that are directly dedicated to books. And to my knowledge, there are no clear or direct commentaries on the Firist in particular.
And then if I may, the next questions are for Alexandre. It's actually two questions. First, do the references...
May I ask who it is? Just to have a
it's
name.
Flavio Davacqua.
Okay, thank you.
Do the references to the word chemia in non-chemical Greek sources, such as photios or synkelos, corroborate your hypothesis, or is the evidence too scarce to understand if they meant a particular type of science? And two, do you think that after the splitting of alchemy and chemistry in the Renaissance time, another, quote, fault of this terminological problem is due to Zosimos's interpretation by Jung?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for both those questions. So All right, so yeah, that what I would say is, I think that with the Chimia, what I would say is, as a shorthand, since we're very close out of time, is that what I'm partly building on the work of people like Gerasimus Merianos, who has a nice survey. It's a very short and it's not totally comprehensive, but a survey of sort of different terms as they're used. And he sort of argues that Chimia seems to he is still working with the idea. He calls it that he translates as alchemy, but he also problematizes it and sees it as sort of not quite matching the modern usage of alchemy, the way people use it. Use chimia, and that it changes over time, including in non-alchemical sources. Also Olivier Dufault, and it's both talk about, there are various examples of these, like people that we call alchemists. So this isn't a usage of chimia, but it's the inverse. People we say, oh, that's an alchemist because he's like some magician who's like makes stuff, counterfeit gold coins and blah, blah, blah. And then they never use the word chimia in it. And like, we're talking about, maybe we're talking about a counterfeiter who's being punished for. So I think that's a, not even that brief, but a brief attempt to sort of at least hand wave that question. And but definitely needs to be done comprehensively. I agree. The other one, the sort of split and Jung, I think it's not so much Jung, who is very influential, and that is, I think, a mid-20th century problem. And I think with like Walter Hanegraaff's work on this, we've in a certain way moved beyond it. And instead, the way I would sort of, following Hanegraaff, the way I sort of understand what's going on here is that we have a split that then creates these sort of two institutionalized disciplines in a way that each have their own, so a sort of chemistry and alchemy. There is, I think, using the word alchemy makes a lot of sense as an emic term for the sort of the modern period, because there are people who say we are alchemists, and then we can interrogate what is an alchemist in the 20th century, right? I'm an alchemist, this is alchemy, this is the alchemical tradition, and there's a whole, that exists, that's a real thing in the world. And so that's where the problem is, when we then back project that. I think we feel, as Hanegraaff says, there's a sort of, if you're not an alchemist in the 20th century, you may feel a certain repulsion to alchemy as a discipline. And that then colors how you read alchemists, or anybody you identify as alchemists in the past, and you maybe back project certain assumptions about what is embraced by that field. So again, I should cut myself short, but that's, I think, more how I think about what then is causing a lot of our conceptual confusion. We have this modern baggage.
Thank you both for wonderful talks. My question is for Dr. Ahmed. Does Ibn Nadim record the reactions of kind of the nascent Ahl Sunnah scholars, as they've become known, who were kind of champions of Ulum al-Naqliyyah, the transmitted sciences, to the translation movement? Does he talk about the reaction of Hadith scholars or jurists at all?
That's a great question. It's not, I mean, Ibn Nadim himself, not really. So the question is about the response of the scholars of prophetic traditions, who were sort of often perceived to be more on the more conservative side of this period to the translation. The most heated debates, honestly, about translation happen in relation to what they perceive to be improper use of language. So it's a very kind of formal thing, like, this word is bad. We have like a big debate around all of these words you're getting from Greek logic that you just decide to transliterate. It's just because you don't know how to speak Arabic, right? So it maps onto a big debate in grammar, in Arabic grammar and schools of grammar, between the Kufa school and the Basra school at the time. And the Baghdadi school sort of falls a little bit with the Basra for some time, and later on shifts a little bit with the Kufa school. So it's a debate that is part and parcel of the construction of medieval Arabic, standardized medieval Arabic at the time. And rather than a debate around, is this good knowledge or bad knowledge, or is there a problem with this knowledge being transmitted or not? Now, the big debate that happens with, Fitnat Khalq al-Quran, or the debate around the creation, is the Quran created or infinite? The big problem is about preaching, not about the books, right? So that's really the problem. Those
who want to who call themselves the strict monotheists, if you will, or Ahl al-Tawheed, are saying you have to preach that the Quran is created and that it was made in time as opposed to infinite. And the others say you cannot preach it because it's not mentioned in the same way in the Quran. So that's obviously a very tiny summary of a very long debate. But my point is, nobody is saying it's all because you translated these books and we shouldn't have translated them, right? Nobody is saying, oh my God, you should have never brought these books from Constantinople. But everybody is talking about preaching, right? Should you be able to preach this or not? Because that's really how the knowledge is going to spread. And they are not really, again, there is a whole tradition of literature that's called al-milal wal-nihal, which is cults and traditions that is precisely about writing about bad ideas. That just is there. It's a huge tradition. And so many books written by the most conservative scholars who writing, these people are saying and summarizing the literature of all those who they disagree with, whether polytheists or Sunnis writing about Shiites or Shiites writing about Sunnis or different branches of people. So what I'm trying to say is the idea that somebody is objecting or finding it problematic that you're collecting the books or writing about them or translating them, we put too much on the book thing, while a lot of the debate is about what's next. What are you teaching? Because you still teach al-milal wal-nihal, right? These books are taught and commented on, but how do you teach them? You teach them as these are bad ideas, right? So are you going to teach it as bad ideas or are you going to teach it as great ideas? And that's the kind of, the dynamic here. And of course, I realize that I'm making a generalization. Certainly there were people who thought you shouldn't bring these Milli books in Baghdad. I mean, I bet. But, at least the overall record is showing that book collection, great, let people collect books. It's not a problem. It's all about, are you going to preach these things and how are you going to do that?
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic session. And before we thank our speakers, just want to remind folks in our coffee break coming up for the next 25 minutes, there's also an exhibit in the Lee Library of manuscripts. We got some Dioscorides and several other people mentioned in the talks here. So please do check out some of those manuscripts. And thank you again once more.